Welcome to our first installment of our series of sit-downs. I'm Owen, and that's James, and today we're pleased to have joining us Mr. Joe Frank. Mr. Frank is the former mayor of Newport News, a position which he held for 14 years, and has practiced law as a civil litigator around his career in public service for the past 53 years. Mayor Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, let's get right into it. What prompted you to first get into politics and run for city council?
That's an interesting story. I used to help people get elected and help raise money for them, and never ever had any interest in serving in public office. And one day I was sitting in my law office minding my own business, and a group of 10, maybe 12 community leaders showed up unannounced and got into my office and explained to me that I had a responsibility to run for city council. Whereupon I responded that my mother didn't raise any dumb children and I had no intention of doing anything like that. I couldn't get them to leave. So finally, they said there must be something we could do to persuade you to do this. Whereupon I said, okay, I'll give you the name of some folks, and if you talk to them and they all think that I should do it, and they all agree that they will contribute to the campaign, not just money, but work, effort, help in the campaign, then I'll talk to my law partners and I'll talk to my wife and I'll consider what you're asking me to do. I was 100% certain that not one of the people in that room was going to call any one of those people that I gave them on the list, and that I was home free. However, I was wrong. By that afternoon late, I'd heard from probably 70% of the people that was on the list, and it was a long list, and everybody said they wanted me to run, they thought I should, and they'd contribute and they'd work in the campaign. So I sort of got stuck because I said if those people did that, I would consider it. So I went to my law partners, pretty certain that they'd say, are you nuts? And, but they didn't. And then I went to see my wife, and when I went home that night, and she thought it was a great idea. She probably regretted that a few minutes later, but she said it was a great idea. So I did, and I ran. The first time I ran, I can't remember how many candidates were running for city council, but it was a lot of them, like 11. And on election night, I thought I had lost. Finally, when the last precinct and the last votes were in, I think I won that election by 111 votes. And they called me Landslide Frank. After that, I never had a close election. Generally, when I was running for mayor, I think the closest I ever got to, the smallest percentage I ever got was 68% of the vote, if my memory serves me. And more often than not, I didn't have much by way of competition. And I get 70, 80, sometimes 90-some% of the vote. And here I am. I did it for 14 years. I retired in 2010. I was approaching 68, and I thought that I was putting in 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week in being mayor, and my sense was that I didn't know whether my health would allow me to continue doing that for another 4 years, and that people had an expectation of me being available that many hours and going to everything and every meeting and every event, and that if I couldn't keep up with that schedule, people would be wondering what was going on and what was wrong. And so I decided better to leave when people wanted you to stay than stay until people wanted you to leave. So I retired after 14 years as mayor, 22 years on city council, 3 years as vice mayor. And that's sort of the story.
Was ensuring that there was a replacement for yourself that you felt confident in something that you considered before your retirement?
Well, I went to see my dear friend McKinley Price, who is the current mayor, and I told him that I thought he should run. And I told him wasn't much to it, that you just presided at city council meetings, and every now and then you had to make an appearance someplace. And there just wasn't much to it. And his wife was not real happy about the idea, and I went and explained to her that there wasn't much to it. And the night of election, he won, and we were backstage at the Omni Hotel, waiting to go to see the people who had come to celebrate victory. And I said, call me tomorrow and I'll tell you the truth. So I did. But he's a terrific person, and he cares about the city, and he has a vision that I think is appropriate and important. And I was pleased that he ran and won. So,
So you endorsed his
oh, yeah.
campaign. So switching gears a little bit, you have a unique political perspective in that you've been a public servant for practically your whole adult life. So you wrote a white page years ago advocating for a regional Hampton Roads government. And can you just briefly outline what purpose that would serve, what issues it would solve, and how it fits into the current local government and state government that we have?
Well,
today?
there are 17 different jurisdictions in Hampton Roads, and each city, each county, and each one of them has either a city council or a board of supervisors, and on average, they have 7 members each. Some have a few more, some of the counties have a few less, but on average, 7 people on each board. There are issues that permeate the entire region, like sea level rise, like climate change, like job creation, like workforce training, like dealing with the federal and state governments, that really don't stop at local boundaries. I mean, if you don't live here all your life, you don't know where Hampton ends and Newport News begins unless you look at the street sign. And so there's so much that we have in common, but there's so many critical decisions that need to be made as we move forward and changes come, and as technology begins to take over for what people used to do, that my feeling was that trying to get 17 local governments to agree to the same thing in a timely way and to work collegiately with regard to that was becoming more and more challenging. People are elected to local government to look after the communities they were elected to represent, not to look after the interest of the whole region. So if you get a mayor who is regionally oriented and committed to helping with regional issues, that's good. You get somebody who is more parochially oriented, then they don't really engage, they don't really participate, and just hard to get things done. One of the examples that maybe I should make is a couple of years ago I was told by a senior naval person about all the money they were spending at Norfolk Naval Base to address sea level rise, like raising the height of the piers and taking underground utilities and putting them on first floor buildings, and just spending lots of money to ensure that Norfolk Naval Base would not be underwater as the sea began to rise and storms began to create more and more problems. And I said, well, that's all fine, But is Virginia Beach doing that? And is Norfolk doing that? Is Portsmouth doing that? Is Suffolk doing that? And is Chesapeake doing that? Same thing you're doing. No. I said, well, then what you've done is created an island where nobody can get to you because you're up here and they're still down here. It's an illustration of why separate efforts are not as effective as joint planning and joint projects. There are a lot of community regional agencies, the Hampton Roads Planning Commission, the Hampton Roads Metropolitan Planning Organization deals with roads, that deal with regional issues. But there are a lot of regional issues that are not as effectively addressed as if we had a regional government. Now, most people don't want a larger government. They want to have more direct contact with their elected officials and not more remote contact. They don't want to have another entity that can charge taxes, and they'll have the risk of having to pay more taxes. My idea was that, if certain responsibilities were left to the local communities, like schools and police and roads and zoning, schools, that would be the province of the local governments. And then areas like public transportation and highways and environmental issues, job creation and business development and recruiting were more regional. And I thought that we could have a regional council where there were one elected person for every 200,000 people in the region, which meant that no one person would represent a city, but they would have their own district, and that they'd have a regional mayor, and their job was to look after the regional issues, and that a lot of the regional commissions, which don't have direct elected supervision, could come under the umbrella of this regional government, like the Hampton Roads Sanitation District Commission, water supply systems, those kinds of things that are really truly regional in nature. And that governments could charge less taxes because they'd have less responsibilities to have to pay for. And then there could be a surtax on state income tax that would not require a separate collection mechanism of taxes, which is expensive, that would fund the needs of the regional government. So that was the idea.
What would you say, what would you say to the person who says, all right, great idea, but how are the logistics going to work? More specifically, currently there's 3 levels of government generally: local, state, and federal. And the local governments govern, the immediate local area, and the state government sets their parameters and so on and so forth. And state code says, the state tax is taken and sent to Richmond and then indiscriminately spent throughout the state, in that, Northern Virginia gave 60% garnered 60% of the state income tax. So they get 60% of the returns and so on and so forth. And the point of the state tax is that you collect it from everywhere and it's spent wherever it's needed throughout the state. So if you're doing a surtax on the state tax to fund just a regional project, doesn't that operate against the idea of the state government only governing the entire state, as opposed to just saying, you pay this much so you get this dividend and so on and so forth?
Well, no, because you're not changing the income that the state receives. A surtax means that it's there for a special purpose. the special purpose is to fund the regional government, and it's only charged for people that live in that governmental area. There's nothing unusual about this. If you go to most major cities in the United States, all of the cities are part of counties, which is a regional government. They provide, the counties provide certain services, and the local governments provide certain services. And it's not that unusual, and cities that have that arrangement prosper and are successful and do very well. So, I mean, it's doable. It's just a question of making the necessary changes in state law that allow it to happen, but it's not complicated.
Yeah. So something would need, some legislation would need to go through the state to form this?
Sure.
Okay. So just one more follow-up. I assume you can't, like, what would you say to, within the regional government, people who say, you know, Williamsburg has different wants and needs than, or like, say Williamsburg's a little higher up, so Williamsburg doesn't like the fact that, you know, they're paying a surtax to come and raise the piers in Norfolk. And what would you say to the Williamsburg people who say, why am I paying for this? It doesn't affect me, and I don't really care what goes on in Norfolk. I don't feel as if the regional government really looks out for my interests. Like, maybe there'd be multiple regional governments that align with the topography of Virginia.
The thing is that what the regional government would be doing would be beneficial to everyone, and if there was something unique to Williamsburg or a particular community, those would be the responsibilities that remain with their local government and their local elected people. So I don't see that as being a significant issue at all. You know, I mean, this thing has to be studied and it needs to be thought through carefully. But, you know, sea level rise, land subsidence, environmental issues, job creation, education, education in terms of public education should be left locally. They have different issues, and schools should be close to the people. But the thing like sanitation commission and planning commission and things like that are already regional. It's just a question of where the control is and how you get people in charge of that have a regional view.
All right, I'd like to go back to your first election as mayor, and in that year, Newport News transitioned from electing their mayors by a city council vote to directly electing their mayors.
Hmm?
And so was that something that you supported, that change?
Well, it's a long time ago. There was an effort by some elements of the community to change the city voting from everybody on city council being elected citywide to having districts. And the Justice Department got involved in that on the theory that if you had districts, the minority communities would have a better shot at having minority representation. Mm-hmm. And as part of that process, they came up with the direct election of mayor. It was also a time when we had appointed school boards, and there was an effort to create elected school boards. I frankly opposed that because I thought if we were going to have elected school boards, they ought to have their own separate taxing authority so they could define what they wanted to ask people to pay to support the school system and defend their rationale and why they thought what they were trying to do was appropriate. Legislature created elected school boards but didn't give them taxing authority, which is why we have these conflicts between the school boards and the city council today, because they can't agree over what's an appropriate amount of funding. I think that kind of thing is a mistake. But I think that the idea of a directly elected mayor is an appropriate one, just like the governor is elected, you know, statewide,
Right.
the president is elected throughout the country, not by the Congress, for example. So I think that that decision was an appropriate one, rather than having members of the city council select somebody of their own choosing. And that's how it happened.
So just to clarify, you were not opposed to directly electing the school board members, just the way that it was implemented, you felt?
Yeah,
made things
I
difficult.
really thought that they should have taxing authority.
So, another follow-up is, what's the check? Like, isn't it in the school board's best interest to basically get as much money as possible? Like, what checks them for asking for it? I mean, obviously, if they ask for an unreasonable amount of money that's egregious, then they'll be voted out. But, I mean, there is some reasonable limit that they could go above, and, you know, the people wouldn't necessarily take it out against them in the voting booth, but it might cost the city council.
I'm not sure I'm clear about the question, but let me give it a shot. The way it works now is the school boards adopt a budget,
Right.
and it talks about their expenses, their needs, compensation to their staff, including teachers, what it takes to operate the school buildings and pay their administrative people and their maintenance people and operate the school buses and provide books and all the stuff that go into having a school system. And they develop a budget. And then they go to city council and say, here's how much we need. And then city council goes through that budget, actually the staff goes through that budget, sits down and talks with the school people to understand, you know, what the particulars of the school's recommended or requested budget is. And then city council has the duty to determine what they're gonna provide in terms of funding for the operation of public schools. Historically, that's not been
Particularly amicable, I would say.
terribly problemsome. Recently, there've been a disconnect, I think is a proper word, between what the city council thinks is appropriate and what the school board thinks it needs. And you get into a discussion, for example, about replacing Huntington Middle School. I think that's a $57 million project. And I'm not sure that either side have yet reached an agreement as to whether to do that and whether it's really necessary. I, for one, think they ought to look at the census. I think Newport is probably losing some population, and that the 2020 census will reflect that. And I'm not sure that the school population is growing. But you have to look at those kinds of things in any event, whether I'm right or wrong about that, and see if you really need another school. They're talking about building a new library. My question is, in 10 years, are people still going to be using libraries?
Yeah.
You know, in 10 years, are people still going to be printing books?
Yeah.
I don't know that, but technology is certainly making inroads in all of those things, and so you have to be looking ahead to determine whether what you've done traditionally in terms of school construction or library construction remains relevant in an age where technology is changing things so quickly that the world is a changing place, and you need to meet the needs of the upcoming generations and the future, and take into account that, for example, there's almost no retail left, and it's diminishing every day. Amazon seems to be taking over. And you just need to be forward-thinking about what the community's needs are going to be, not just as a function of what they have been historically, but are they going to continue to be those same needs, or are they going to be different?
Mm-hmm.
And is the even if you need some of them, or all of them, are they going to have the same requirements that they have historically? You know, do you need as many of them? Do you need as much of it? Those are things that have to be discussed and thought about if you're going to manage the public's funds responsibly.
So another thing that I wanted to ask about, you're talking about seeing what the needs used to be and then changing with the current needs of the community. In 1998, during your time as mayor, you were upset about something, and it led you to propose that Virginia implement a new cabinet-level position entitled Secretary of Urban Affairs. Was there any one incident during your mayorship that said, or that made you think the state isn't looking out for the urban centers in Virginia and this needs to happen? And given the time since then, is that still necessary?
Well, whether it's necessary or not, I'm not sure. Is it something that I think is productive and useful to do? Yes, I do. What happens is, it wasn't some event in 1998. I have been involved not only in the City of Newport News, but in all kinds of regional organizations since I joined City Council in 1988. More responsibility in each one as time went on. And there were a myriad of different state organizations and agencies that provided some level of service to local government. But it wasn't always coordinated as effectively as it should have been, in my opinion. And it didn't get the emphasis. The great majority of people in the legislature, when I last knew something about it may be different today, come from rural areas of the Commonwealth. And, you know, you had a Department of Agriculture, I think, and you had all of these state agencies, but there were none that actually focused on the emerging cities and counties that were big or bigger than cities like Fairfax. And having a department and a secretary who was in charge of those pieces of other departments that focused on the needs of the urban communities in Virginia, I think brought to the cabinet level and to the governor's table of advisors people whose responsibility was focusing on the emerging needs of growing cities and counties throughout the Commonwealth. And that's why I proposed it.
So that same year, 1998, you also expressed your frustration with the fact that there's little room for economic growth in Virginia's cities. That's improved somewhat since then, but they still are in the middle of the pack in terms of economic growth, largely due to their military dependence. And so what would you like to see done policy-wise in order to help stimulate economic growth in Virginia?
There's a lot being done. I mean, the state has an active recruiting effort to bring business and industry into the state. The region does, local government does. Hampton Roads, I think it used to be, and I think it still is, the biggest concentration of military facilities in the United States. And every branch of the military is represented here, Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army, Coast Guard. If I left out something.
Marine Corps.
I thought I said that, yes, Marine Corps. And they're all subject to political decisions that are made by Congress and budgeting decisions that are made by Congress. And you get a different Congress, you get a different president, there's not consistency. And so, for example, and I don't want to be a prophet of doom and gloom, but if you look at what's happening with technology, and you look at the drones, and what the capacity of these drones are, and the drones fully operational and capable. I can't remember, but I think they're like $15 million each or something like that, maybe more. But if you look at the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, that's $185 million a plane. An aircraft carrier needs 85 of those things. Aircraft carriers today are costing somewhere around $14 billion to build, have 5,000 people on them, have a surface group of submarines, cruisers, missile cruisers, and other components that make the operation of a carrier group very expensive. Well, if the Air Force decides, as an example, that drones are cheaper to buy and maintain, put no pilot's life at risk in combat, then you don't need a Langley Air Force Base to operate drones. You can do that from anywhere. They're operated, you know, somebody
Yeah.
with a human computer. If you look at Langley Air Force Base, which floods now in a major storm and has to move their planes out somewhere in the west to get them out of harm's way if a hurricane is coming, we could lose a Langley Air Force Base. Where Langley Air Force Base and NASA Langley are situated are in very low-lying areas of the peninsula. So with land subsidence and sea level rise, you could very well see the time when those facilities are determined not to be necessary and that their mission can be transferred somewhere else. NASA has, I think, 11 full-time laboratories around the country, and I'm guessing that much, if not all, of the work done at NASA Langley could be replicated effectively at other communities. You don't have to spend all that money to make them sort of sea level rise proof.
Yeah.
So just as an example, if the drones do what they are capable of doing, and if the political decisions are to replace manned jet fighters by drones, then, and that technology, you know, improves every day. It's not like it's fixed in time. You could very well get to the point where the Navy won't need aircraft carriers, or if they do, they won't be the same magnitude and size and cost as they are today. Well, the 23,000 people that work at that shipyard, how many of those people will still be employed, you know, if they're not building aircraft carriers anymore? I don't know. What alternative work that the shipyard might do, they know, I don't. But they are looking at alternatives, I know that, and they're acquiring other businesses to maintain their, you know, economic base, but they're not all here in Newport News. And if you walk around the different areas of the region, you'll see that there's risk that we won't have the same impact of federal spending. I mean, when you used to know something about it, I think federal spending was like 55% of the economic impact in Hampton Roads. Today, I think it's like 37%. Don't hold me to that because I really haven't studied it in the last several years. But it's something like that. In any event, the point I make is that when you're dependent on Congress for reliable, stable resources and spending, that's a high risk. And then when you look at Amazon and you drive down Warwick Boulevard or Jefferson Avenue or any other street, and you see all the empty stores, you see all the retail that's closing, then and go into the malls and see the stores that are empty, you realize there are a lot of people who are without jobs. You go into the coal mines, there are a lot of people who used to be miners who don't have employment anymore. Well, what are we going to do? And I'm getting off the question, I know.
Yeah.
But what are we going to do with those people? They have houses with mortgages on them. They have cars with loans on them. They have children in school that have to be paid, tuition. What are those people going to do to support themselves? And the point of all of this is we need to be looking as a region at these impacts on the entire region. And, of the people working at the shipyard, not everybody lives in Newport News. They live in North Carolina. They live all over Hampton Roads. They live in Hampton and Williamsburg and Gloucester and Matthews. So, what happens in each of those places has some impact on all of those places. If you don't believe me, go stand at the entrance to Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel early in the morning when people are going to work and late in the afternoon when they're going home, and you'll see the number of people that live on this side of the water and work on that side of the water, live on that side of the water and work on this side of the water.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it a region. So you have to be mindful that we're all in this together.
Yep.
And we have to have solutions that address the issues that impact everybody.
And that discussion about manufacturing away jobs has been a huge point in the 2020 election cycle, and
Yes.
something that's been discussed tremendously nationally lately. So are there any policies that you've noticed in terms of combating it that you feel have promise? Or
Well, for example, I think one of the critical things we need to be doing that is being done some, but not nearly enough, is, well, what I'm fond of saying is that when a retail store closes, there are 7.5 million jobs in the United States that are open and they can't find people to fill them. And they can't find people to fill them because not the people with the education, training, experience that are necessary for those particular jobs.
Mhm.
So if you get somebody who is working at, I'll make up something, 7-Eleven, they can't go to NASA Langley and get a job as a rocket scientist.
Yeah.
They just don't have the
Yeah,
training or
absolutely not.
qualification. So we need to be doing a great deal more than we are doing in workforce training. And what we need to do, not just worry about kids in high school getting good training for jobs, we need to be training for jobs of the future. Well, I once wrote a white paper on the future of public education in Newport News, and I pointed out that if Rip Van Winkle awoke and came to Newport News when I wrote this paper, The only thing different about the schools that he attended and the schools that we have now are the blackboards are now green, and that we're not training kids for the jobs of the future. Well, the superintendent, who's a dear friend of mine, still is, took me to task and said, well, Joe, if you could tell us what the jobs of the future are going to be, we'll figure out how to train for them. Well, the problem is, we don't know what the jobs of the future are going to be because the future is changing so quickly, and technology is changing daily. I mean, what we know about technology today isn't what we're going to know about it tomorrow, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. It's just changing that quickly. So people have to learn the skills of communication and math and collegial working and, you know, skill sets that allow them to be adaptable to whatever jobs emerge. You know, I'm fond of saying that kids born 100 years from now will only have thumbs, they won't have fingers, because all they'll be doing is playing with, you know, cell phones. Problem is, there won't be any. You know, I don't know what there will be, but I'm pretty sure there won't be cell phones. The point I'm making is that we need to be thinking about how we impact on people's lives. I have a client, I won't mention it by name, who's a major utility, and the kind of work they do is going to put a lot of people who work in coal mines out of business. People have no jobs. Well, those people have homes, they pay mortgages on, they have cars, they have car payments on, they have kids in school, and if they're unemployed, what are they going to do? And then we're talking about welfare, we're talking about God knows what, but we're talking about people losing their lives. I mean, losing the quality of their lives. So my view is we've got to set up workforce training centers around, and we've got to pay people to train so that they don't lose their income and can make their mortgage payments and make their car payments and keep their kids in college, and not just expect them to come to school and pay a tuition kind of thing to learn a new trade. Those are new concepts, and they're hard for people to digest, but the world is changing so quickly and so intensively that if we're not paying close attention to where we're heading and where technology is taking us and where change is happening, and trying to look ahead to understand what the impacts of that are going to be, you know, we're going to be in real trouble. And you see countries around the world where people are taking to the streets and rioting and overthrowing their governments and all that kind of stuff because of the quality of their lives and how they're not getting the help that they need to survive and thrive. And I don't think we should put ourselves in that position. And I'm fond of saying that McDonald's can't hire everybody. So we really have to focus on how technology is changing the world we live in and how we can accommodate that and how we can adapt to that so that people can continue to have a quality existence that is so important to the quality of their lives and the success of themselves and their families.
So another thing that you've been mentioning lately is a big issue facing Hampton Roads is soil erosion and sea level rise. And that's also been a big topic. Climate change has been discussed tremendously over the course of especially the Democratic debates as of late. Is there anything that stuck out to you, you know, any modern proposals? You're saying we need to see these problems in advance and act now. Is there anything out there now that you think is the solution to climate change?
You know, I'm no expert on that. I know what I read, I know what I hear. I chaired a group at Old Dominion University a couple of years ago now. Representatives from the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, Coast Guard, Virginia Institute of Marine Science, Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, representatives from local government, representative from Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, others, that looked at the impact of sea level rise. Well, sea level rise is a function of climate change. As the globe warms, I mean, the last 4 summers are the hottest summers we've ever had in the history, documented history of the world, and particularly this country. And as the ice melts in the Arctic and Antarctic, that water has somewhere to go, seas rise. There's also a problem here in this region of something called land subsidence. Years ago, there was a million years, I don't know how many years ago, long time. There was a meteor that came, and it created a big hole. And over time, it filled with water, and then land came over it. Well, now what's happened is, after centuries, enough water has been withdrawn for irrigation, drinking and all that, feeding farm animals and stuff, that the water is no longer supporting the land, and land's going down. When the land goes down and the water comes up.
Yeah, we got an issue.
Exactly. And either one would be enough.
Yeah.
A combination of two is interesting. So, can there anything be done? One of the problems in getting some politicians to understand that this really is a real issue is that of all the studies that are done, all the data that has been collected, they don't all lead to the same results. For example, you can see a study where it says that the water will be 7 feet higher than it is today by 2030. Yeah. And then you'll get another study that'll say, no, it won't get that high until 2040. Well, you tell a politician who's up for election in November that it's 10, 15, 20 years away. They're not most of them, or not most of them, many of them, not motivated to do anything about it and let it be somebody else's problem, particularly if they've got to go to their electorate and say, you're going to have to pay more taxes for us to deal with this. But if you can get past not believing in science, then there's plenty of science. And greenhouse emissions, fossil fuel burning, coal, petroleum, are major factors. Automobile exhausts are major factors. And what they do is they penetrate the protective layers in the atmosphere that keep the heat from the sun from being as impactful on the earth as it is becoming now. And given that, the idea of regulating those things and eliminating those things is a significant part of the solution. Problem is, it's not just the United States problem. The United States has to be a leader in that because the rest of the world pays attention to what we do. And unfortunately, the rest of the world is paying attention to what we're not doing now. And so we need to take the bull by the horns. We need to address these issues. And we can't pretend like they're going to go away, or that they don't exist even, which some of our so-called leaders don't believe in. And it's a tough thing politically, because nobody in an elected office wants to say, we've got problems and we've created these problems and now we've got to fix them. And, you know, they're not going to be in office forever. So if they can wait it out and let it be somebody else's problem down the road, they don't have time to wait it out anymore. And so I think the answer to your question is simply that we know what needs to be done. We may not know everything that needs to be done, but we know enough about what needs to be done that we need to do it. And we don't have time to talk about it, and we don't have time to debate about it, and we don't have time to ignore it. There's a price to pay, a significant price to pay for ignoring it, and that price is the health of ourselves and our families and our children and grandchildren and their children. And I think it's a civic responsibility of every one of us to stand up and say, enough's enough and we need to deal with this. Economically, huge cost. I mean, you know, if everybody had to stop driving their automobile next Tuesday, you can imagine what the cost of that is in terms of delivering goods and getting to work and getting to school and all that kind of stuff, just to put it in simple terms. But it's got to be addressed, and somebody's got to have the character and the integrity and the strength and the purpose of taking it on and changing the world's mindset and convincing people that if we do nothing, the consequences are just disasters.
So just to sort of wrap things up here, just generally, are you happy with the direction Hampton Roads is going, or do you think some things need to change but we're generally on the way up? Or do you think, you know, military spending's being cut, climate change is happening, things are going to be moved elsewhere, there's a declining population, and overall we're on the way down and we should all be looking for a new house somewhere else?
Well, that's a great question, I think. I recently organized a group of community leaders who, like the president of Huntington Ingalls, the president of Riverside Health Systems, the president of Town Bank, the sheriff, the former superintendent of schools, some business leaders, some civic leaders, some pastors, to look at leadership, recruitment, and development. My concern is that we need to get a group of younger people who are of a generation that are not afraid of change and who are willing to, as a matter of civic responsibility, get engaged in the community. And we're trying to identify who those people are, and we're trying to mentor them and give them an opportunity to learn what those of us of an older generation have learned, and help them figure out how they can engage and help them engage. And as part of that, I've invited a group of younger people to come to our meetings and talk about what they like about the community, what they don't, what needs to be changed, what needs to be done away with, what can be improved, so that the quality of life here is something that they want to be part of and remain part of and contribute to, and stay and work and live and raise a family. So we've started engaging those people to understand what their thinking is and what their requirements and issues are, and I'm hopeful that that will be at least be a small piece of how we help move things forward. But the fact of the matter is that we're at risk of losing some federal support for various federal activities in the area. We've seen signs of that already. Sea level rise is going to inundate parts of Hampton, Pocosa, York County, Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Portsmouth. Newport News, not so much. We're on the high side of the peninsula. But when that happens, I think you're going to start seeing people leave the area. And as retail closes down, people are going to have to find jobs somewhere. And like I say, McDonald's can't employ everybody, but neither can the shipyard. And so I think we're at risk of losing population. I think we need to work really hard to bring in businesses. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is that when banks take the sea level rise stuff seriously, they're going to start calling loans on houses that are in low-lying areas. Because if I'm a bank and I got a 30-year loan on your house, and your house is going to be 10 feet underwater before 30 years comes around, I don't want to be on a loan on a house that's underwater,
Yeah.
literally underwater. Someone call your loan, and then you're going to leave that house. And at my bank, I'm not going to invest in a new business that wants to open up in one of those areas because my security will be impaired. So you get all those kinds of things that come into play that people have to be thinking about and talking about. And the problem is, I really shouldn't say this, getting people to think about really difficult issues and understand them and get educated about them is challenging. People have a hard time facing, they got enough problems to deal with today without spending a lot of their time worrying about tomorrow.
Yeah. So just a quick follow-up. You mentioned, about trying to attract businesses and get them, bring in different corporations and stuff like that to try and recoup a lot of the jobs that we can predict that we're going to lose over these next couple of years. So, obviously there was a lot of controversy as far as like incentivizing Amazon in the state of New York. Is that something that you're in favor of, giving big corporations incentives in order to bring them into the state?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that the present Congress and political process, which opens up a whole new can of worms that we could talk about for another month or two, incentivizes the big corporations to put smaller business out of business, that they become so gigantic that there's very little possibility of anybody really competing with them. And that lets them do pretty much whatever they want. They control the politicians by money. For example, if you looked at the Democratic debate last night, the pharmaceutical industries were running ads during the debates about what wonderful things they were doing and, while they were saving the world.
Yeah.
And the Democratic candidates are saying, they're making so much money, they're screwing people, and that people are dying because they can't afford the medicines. Well, that's a challenge. I don't have a bad feeling about big business if they're responsible big businesses, meaning they got to pay taxes. Well, I don't know this to be true, but I'm told that Amazon doesn't pay taxes. If that's true, that's outrageous. If Amazon's going to put people, the shipyard 100 years ago created an apprentice school program with the idea that they take people out of the community, put them in a school, and teach them trades that they would then, and pay them while they were going to school. and train them so they could become employees of the shipyard that are productive and make a decent salary. Numbers of presidents of the shipyard came out of that apprentice school program. If we train people for jobs and gave them the skills and tools they needed to be successful, those 7 million jobs that are now open could be available. And those people could have gainful employment and decent benefits and contribute to the economy. But if you allow the NRA and you allow the big businesses like the oil and coal and pharmaceuticals and all of that to do whatever the hell whatever they want to do without any controls and without any sense of civic responsibility. I mean, you shouldn't have to tell a business that they have a duty to the public. They should, the leadership should understand that their success depends on the ability of the public to buy their product and to live a decent life, and that they're part of society and they have to help pay the cost of society. But getting rich is their only goal. And, you know, some of them have this ego that says, well, look what I got, and I'm a self-made man. You hear that all the time, a woman. And those people should do what I did.
Yeah.
Well, they can't. They don't have the education, they don't have the training, they don't have the experience, and the world's not ready to allow them to get there. That's not to say there aren't exceptions to that, but when you look at the masses of people who are unemployed, if you don't find a way to help them lift themselves up, we're going to have a society that is going to be dependent, and my worry is that at some point they're going to be disruptive, that we're going to see riots on the streets and lots more than peaceful protests.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for this installment. Thank you again, Mr. Frank, for joining us, and we really appreciate your time.
Well, I enjoyed it myself, and thank y'all for doing this. You know, I have to say that I think that what y'all are trying to do is really remarkable. And I think if more young people were engaged in this kind of thing and prepared to make a difference and help educate people, it's a wonderful thing to do. So I wish you well, and I think you should be congratulated on the work you're doing.
Thank you.
So
Thank
I
you,
do.
we appreciate it.